She arrived quietly, like someone who didn't want to be noticed, wearing a faded floral dress, old sandals, and a small crocheted purse. Some thought she was lost. Others didn't look twice. But there was something about her. Something no one could name. A silence too heavy to be mere weariness. Eyes that held more history than most sermons. And a presence no one could explain, but no one could forget. On the most important Sunday of the year, the richest church in town was full. Everything was perfect. Lights, cameras, rehearsed choirs, a golden pulpit. Everything. Except her. She didn't fit. She looked like she belonged to another time. Or maybe to another kind of faith. When they stopped her at the door, the reason was simple. She's not dressed properly. But no one knew that when everything failed that day. She'd be the one to save it. She asked for nothing, didn't protest, didn't argue. She just sat, outside, on the most forgotten bench of the entire church. But while the congregation waited for the highlight performance, the sound cut out, the voices stopped, and then something strange happened. A melody rose from outside. A voice untrained, unrehearsed, yet it made the church freeze, and weep, and remember, because that woman wasn't just any woman, but no one knew that yet. Who she once was, what she had done, and the real reason she came that day was a secret time had hidden, a secret heaven decided to reveal through one simple, powerful song. And when her voice crossed those walls, something inside everyone began to break. This isn't a story about perfection. It's about presence, and how the most forgotten seat in the church became holy ground. You'll witness a silent revolution, sparked by someone no one wanted to hear, until there was no one else left to sing. You'll discover who she is, and why, without trying. She changed everything. But beware, some voices don't ask for a stage. They wait. They watch, and at the right moment, they sing. And when they do, pride sits down. This is the story of the woman no one recognized, until it was impossible not to. But who she is, only time and faith will reveal. Faith.
Before diving into this exciting story, we want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our incredible content. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. By subscribing, you'll become a valued member of our growing community, where we share amazing stories, insightful lessons, and much more. Don't wait any longer. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this amazing journey.
Easter morning rose golden, but the sunlight didn't quite reach Miss Lorraine's eyes. Her steps were slow, almost dragging, across the clean sidewalks of Buckhead, Atlanta's elite neighborhood. The floral dress she wore swayed with the breeze, faded like the memories she held close. In her right hand, her crocheted purse pressed against her ribs. In the left, the symbolic weight of a lifetime. No car stopped. No gaze was kind. Some eyes shifted away. Others just stared, as if she didn't belong. Lorraine didn't ask for space, she simply walked, as if fulfilling a vow. She crossed the street cautiously, avoiding a white Mercedes with dark windows. The driver honked impatiently, unaware she carried more than tired feet. Her sandals made barely a sound, but each step echoed childhood hymns. From the time her mother, sitting on a wooden bench, taught her the power of silent prayers. Lorraine passed a group of well-dressed young people laughing loudly. One of them whispered, "Is she lost?" But no one came near. She kept walking, her spine straight like an old prayer. Her faith needed no spotlight. The gates of St. Grace Fellowship loomed ahead, grand and gold. Stained glass windows gleamed in the morning light. The red carpets at the entrance looked crafted for a different kind of guest. Lorraine paused, took a deep breath, lightly touched the old fabric rose pinned to her chest, sewn by her mother decades ago. "Nearer, my God, to thee," she murmured softly. Deep down, she knew she wasn't welcome. But she came anyway, because some promises only make sense when fulfilled in silence. The security guard had been watching since she turned the corner. Tall, uniformed, sunglasses on, he crossed his arms as she approached. "Good morning, sir," she said gently. He didn't reply, just looked at her dress, then her sandals, then the line behind her. Lorraine held his gaze, kind but unflinching. "I have a place here," she said with the weight of truth. He didn't move. A locked door, cold, formal, blind to the invisible. Inside, the choir rehearsed. Technicians adjusted microphones. Reverend Clarice arranged her notes. The atmosphere was more stage than sanctuary. TV crews prepped their lights while Black elite families filled the front rows. Outside, Lorraine still waited. The wind tugged gently at her faded dress. A luxury car pulled up behind her. A woman stepped out in purple hat and gold heels, walked past without a glance. Faith here, it seemed, had a dress code. Lorraine looked to the sky. A plane left a thin white trail overhead. She remembered singing to 5,000 people in an open field back in the 70s. No makeup, no stage, just purpose, just spirit. She smiled faintly, eyes brimming. "Mama, I'm here," she whispered. Then, the shadow of the guard moved. "You, here for the service?" he asked. She nodded. He looked her up and down. "Got an invitation?" he said. She pulled out a folded program she'd gotten at the community center. He didn't take it. "Not enough. This is a private event." Lorraine lowered her gaze. Heavy silence fell. She didn't argue, just breathed deep, shoulders high, dignity untouched. Behind him, a group of women whispered. One chuckled, pointing at her dress. Lorraine pretended not to hear, but she heard. Every giggle a needle through old seams. Still, she didn't retreat. She adjusted her hair with a soft touch, the way her mother used to. The sun now hit her face fully, showing every line time had carved. She looked fragile, but those who truly saw would see courage in that silence. The church bells began to ring. The service was about to start. Lorraine clutched her bag and stepped forward. One step, then another. She reached the edge of the red carpet, but the guard stood firm. He was the wall between past and present. "May I just sit where my mother used to pray?" she asked. His silence answered. Lorraine stepped back, but didn't walk away. Cliffhanger. She slowly turned and saw a bench outside, bathed in sunlight. She walked toward it, sat, opened. Her worn Bible. What would rise from that bench? No one inside could have imagined. The bench outside wasn't welcoming, but Lorraine sat down like someone occupying a seat reserved in heaven. The sun warmed her shoulders as muffled sounds of the service spilled from the speakers by the door. A few children peeked at her from a distance, tugged away by hurried mothers. She opened her Bible to Psalm 27, the one her mother used to read on hard days. Her eyes fell on the words, "Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear." But inside those doors, the army wore suits and silk. Lorraine turned the page gently, like one touches an old scar, and prays. Inside, the pews were full. Women in silk dresses and men in tailored suits fanned themselves with the printed program. Reverend Clarice stood tall in her white and gold robe, preaching about renewal. But the door Lorraine tried to enter remained closed, guarded by a man confusing protocol with exclusion. A loud laugh escaped from a woman stepping outside to answer her phone. She spotted Lorraine and muttered, "At least she knew not to push it." Lorraine raised her eyes, said nothing, just smiled with her lips and prayed with her gaze. The guard watched her from the side. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. A habit that dehumanizes, that turns people into obstacles. Lorraine pulled out a hand-embroidered handkerchief and wiped her palms. She still wanted to go inside, not for recognition, but to see the pew where her mother once knelt. Maybe sit in the row where she first heard the name Jesus spoken gently. It was a search for reunion, not applause, but the door remained closed. There is no passcode for memory, no badge for longing. The service continued with speed. The choir neared the altar. TV crews zoomed in. Clarice quoted the Book of Acts, preaching about open doors, unaware that outside one remained firmly shut. Lorraine closed her eyes, not to sleep, to remember. She remembered her mother scrubbing wooden benches with homemade soap, the church ladies stitching altar cloths, and herself, a child singing Hallelujah in a faded dress and clean voice. A young staff member came over unsure. She held a tray of water bottles for guests. Spotting Lorraine, she hesitated. "Do you need anything, ma'am?" Lorraine looked at the tray. "No, thank you, child. I've already been filled by something greater." The girl smiled, unsure, and walked away, but something in her shifted. Lorraine wasn't offended. She understood. The highest walls aren't made of stone. They're made of expectations. She didn't fit the mold. And that, to some, was threatening. The sun now beamed directly on her face. Lorraine rose and stepped toward the doors once again. The guard straightened. "I just want to sit for a bit," she said, her voice calm but filled with history. He hesitated. "You're not properly dressed for this event." She looked down at her floral dress, the same one she wore at her mother's funeral. "Sorry," he added quickly. Lorraine didn't argue. She just smiled. "I see. I just thought God didn't have a dress code." A group of women exited for pictures in the garden. One of them passed by Lorraine and said loudly, "Is this a church or a shelter now?" The laughs were sharp, fast. Lorraine didn't move. She kept looking at the door, as if still waiting for something the world had long stopped giving. Then the guard pointed to the bench again. "If you want to listen, sit outside." Lorraine looked at the bench, then at the sky, and answered softly, "God hears from outside too," and sat back down. Cliffhanger. Inside the church, the choir began to form for one of the most anticipated moments of the service. Outside, Lorraine closed her eyes and started whispering an old hymn to herself. But heaven, it seems, was listening. The wooden bench outside creaked under Lorraine's light weight, muffled by the choir's rehearsals spilling from the church's wall speakers. She clasped her hands over the Bible and let her eyes drift. The service's words sounded far away, like they had to pass through a barrier between luxury inside and raw faith outside. The fragrance of fresh flowers reached her nose, but none had been offered to her. Lorraine closed her eyes and remembered her mother's scent: soap, old wood, and prayer. The past sometimes returned like that, through scent, through silence. She was there, but no one noticed. Invisible, just as she had always been once the world chose applause over kneeling. A gentle breeze lifted the hem of her dress. Lorraine adjusted her feet quietly. Near the bushes, a hummingbird floated in place, its wings flickering like a prayer in motion. She smiled. Sometimes the world was still kind. A boy emerged from behind a pillar, no more than 7, wearing a white shirt, braided hair, curious eyes. He approached slowly. "Hi. What's your name?" Lorraine turned, surprised by the gentle courage. "I'm just someone who came to worship," she replied softly. The boy tilted his head. "Do you sing?" Lorraine only smiled, like someone hiding a scar wrapped in melody. The boy sat on the ground beside her, his white shirt brushing the dirt. Lorraine gently touched his braids. "My mom says we should listen to the quiet ones," he said. Lorraine felt her throat tighten. His words pierced time like an arrow. She remembered her own mother sitting on that same bench, whispering psalms while watching her daughter sing. "Your mom is wise," Lorraine whispered. Then, with a thread of voice, she began to hum an almost forgotten melody. The boy closed his eyes. as if he knew the tune, or as if his soul recognized what his ears did not. Sometimes the Spirit understands first. Inside, the service picked up speed. Clarice climbed the pulpit. The musicians fine-tuned their instruments. The congregation buzzed with anticipation. The choir's moment was near. Kayla Monroe, the choir leader, focused intently, rehearsing each line in her mind. She didn't know, but outside, a woman in a faded floral dress was about to cross invisible walls with the force of a hymn. Lorraine kept humming, not loud, not trying to be heard, just a prayer floating in melody, soft but full. The boy stayed close. In the purity of childhood, he saw what adults forget, the sacred. A few staff members passed through the side door. One glanced at Lorraine, then looked away. Another clicked his tongue, suspicious, dismissive. Lorraine sat straight. She didn't expect kindness, just hoped God still walked the church halls. The boy pointed toward the building. "The choir's starting." She nodded. "Yes, child. And it'll be beautiful." But inside her, something stirred, as if heaven was holding its breath, as if something sacred was about to break through. The boy ran to the church wall, trying to peek through the stained glass cracks. Lorraine stayed seated. Her fingers traced the edges of her worn Bible. Between the pages, she found an old letter, one her mother wrote before losing speech. "You were born to sing, my child, but sing with your heart, not your throat. The strongest sound comes from within." Lorraine read those words like heaven was whispering instructions. She breathed deep. The choir was lining up inside. It was almost time. She rose slowly, not to enter, but to stand, like someone stepping into a space unseen but deeply felt. The sun broke through the clouds and lit her face like a spotlight from above. Lorraine pressed the letter to her chest. Inside, the sound cut out. Something was wrong with the mic. Music stopped. The crowd shifted in confusion. Lorraine didn't know it, but a door had just opened, and the answer was in her voice. Cliffhanger. Silence fell inside the church like a void, but outside, the boy turned to her with wide eyes and said, "Miss, sing it again." And when she opened her mouth, the world began to shift. Inside the church, Reverend Clarice gave a subtle hand signal to the musicians. The most anticipated moment of the Easter service had arrived. Kayla Monroe climbed the altar steps with composure, dressed in sleek gospel elegance, though her heart raced. This was the peak of the celebration, with hundreds of eyes fixed on the choir. Lights focused on the pulpit, cameras rolled live. Everything needed to be perfect. She inhaled, adjusted her mic, and nodded. The maestro lifted his baton, the keyboard played the intro, and then, nothing. Kayla's microphone went dead, not a crackle, not a buzz, just silence. The choir's audio disappeared, speakers went still. An awkward pause, dry and bare. Musicians exchanged confused looks. Tech staff rushed to the side panel, frantic. Clarice raised her brows. The audience murmured. Someone coughed to break the tension. It was like something unseen had unplugged the voice of the church. Kayla tapped her earpiece. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" The reply was the deepest silence of the morning. Outside, Lorraine still sat, the boy staring at her with quiet urgency. Inside her chest, something stirred. Not pride. A call. As if heaven had silenced the grand stage to let the unseen finally be heard. Lorraine pressed the Bible to her lap. Her mother's voice echoed, "Sing with your heart, daughter. When words fail, your voice will remember." The boy placed a hand on her knee. "Ma'am, now it's your turn." In that small touch, something ignited. Lorraine stood, a little unsteady but with clear eyes. The sun now bathed her face as if nature had joined the congregation. She looked toward the closed stained glass, took a breath, and sang. "Nearer, my God, to thee." Her voice emerged clean, strong, and soft, like time hadn't touched it. Inside, the audience fell quiet. Clarice looked around, stunned. Kayla froze. That voice was coming from outside. Impossible, yet unmistakable. A sound slicing through concrete, ego, and routine. The sound of soul. The live camera kept rolling. The operator scrambled, searching for the source. Lorraine kept singing. Not in performance and in prayer. Her voice didn't seek applause, and it brought comfort. It was the song her mother whispered in her final lucid nights. Inside the church, eyes filled with tears. The melody wasn't new. It was remembered. Childhood. Church before the spotlight. Clarice sat on the altar bench. For the first time in years, she was speechless. Kayla turned. She moved toward the side steps. She knew that song. But more than that, the voice, a tone, a memory. That voice, she whispered as tears welled up. She remembered her grandmother's stories, about a singer who could make preachers weep with one hymn, a woman who left the spotlight to care for her mother, a woman who disappeared, but was never forgotten. That voice breaking through now was her, Lorraine Bishop. The legend thought to have gone silent forever. The boy ran off calling, "She's singing, come see." The news spread through the church like fire on dry grass. Congregants turned their heads. The choir stayed still, as if in reverence. Lorraine sang on. No rush, no embellishment. Each note peeled back pride, pulled down walls, unveiled the sacred. It was as if God whispered, now I speak. Cliffhanger. Kayla, tears on her cheeks, murmured, "My grandma told me about her." And before she could think, her feet were already moving. Toward the door, toward the voice, toward the reunion. Lorraine sang with the power of someone unlocking ancient doors. "Nearer, my God, to thee," flowed from her lips like a confession set to music. Her eyes remained closed, but her heart saw everything. Her mother kneeling, the wooden pulpit, the hand-stitched altar cloth. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady, woven with memory and longing. Inside, the congregation searched for the source. A young man opened the side door. Daylight poured in like an answer. And there she was, Lorraine, sitting in the sunlight, barefoot, yet fully upright in soul. Kayla reached the doorway, breath caught in her chest. When she saw the woman, she froze. Lorraine's face was calm, but every note sounded like it had been stitched from old wounds. A chill ran through Kayla. This wasn't just a voice, it was a bridge, a thread between forgotten sacredness and today's faith. That woman, my grandma told me about her, she whispered, as if recognizing a miracle. The crowd inside stood together, moved by something bigger than them. No one cared about the program anymore. The service had ended. Reverence had begun. Clarice stepped slowly toward the altar. She couldn't speak, just watched. Then tears came, because she understood. Understood what she'd lost when she chose perfection over presence. Lorraine wore no fine shoes, but she stood on holy ground. Her voice needed no microphone. When you carry the spirit, that's volume enough. The musicians went still, the tech crew froze. Everyone just listened, because hearing Lorraine was like hearing the gospel. Before it was edited, outside Lorraine's knees trembled, but she didn't stop. Each verse was an offering. "Though it be a cross that raises me," she sang, and an elderly woman in the front pew broke into tears. A man removed his hat. A child hugged their mother. The boy from before stood off to the side now, smiling. Lorraine didn't notice, but the doors behind her were filled with people. Some stepped out, others knelt, not because anyone asked, but because the spirit had arrived. Kayla stepped closer, eyes full of tears. She stood beside Lorraine, waited. Then, voice trembling, began to sing with her. The second voice was softer, unsure, but full of soul. Lorraine opened her eyes, surprised, looked at the young woman. For a moment she didn't sing, just stared, as if recognizing something deep. Kayla smiled through the tears. "Keep going, ma'am. Now it's all of us." Lorraine nodded, and together, their voices rose to the heavens, like time had returned to retrieve what had been left behind. The congregation joined in now. No sheet music, no rehearsal, just what they remembered from childhood. Clarice fell to her knees. Photographers turned off their cameras. The official service ended. But worship had just begun. Lorraine finished the final note with a long breath. Her eyes glistened, her body tired, but her spirit alive. Finally, she sat down again, pulled out her mother's handkerchief, wiped her cheeks, as if to say, "Mission complete." Cliffhanger. Clarice wipes her tears, rises, and walks slowly toward the door. Her eyes don't just see Lorraine, they see everything the church lost. And she knows. She must do something. Now, before that woman disappears again. As Lorraine and Kayla sang their final note together, time seemed to pause at the door of St. Grace. The breeze drifted gently, carrying a reverence that didn't come from a program, but from presence. Lorraine sat again, breathing deeply, her eyes lowering to the Bible open in her lap. Her fingers touched a marked page, and tucked between the Psalms was an old photo, faded by time. In it, a young woman in a white dress, braids and a microphone sang before a crowd in an open field. Lorraine, before the pain, before the silence. The memory snapped into place. 1970s, wooden churches, uncomfortable chairs, hearts on fire. Lorraine Bishop was known across the South as the voice of fire. Her singing wasn't polished, it was raw surrender. Invitations flooded in, conferences, radio shows, recordings. Pastors competed for her presence. Her voice gathered people from towns far and wide beneath makeshift tents, old speakers, and vibrant spirit. But she never chased spotlight. She sang barefoot, and always returned home to care for her mother who had begun to forget things. She had her chance. A producer once offered her a contract, an apartment in New York, even a new stage name. But her mother Eunice began repeating words, burning meals, forgetting birthdays. Lorraine understood. She packed up the invitations, locked the dream away, stayed. "You're throwing everything away for her?" a friend asked. Lorraine smiled, tired but firm. "My voice came from her. I sing for her now." And just like that, she vanished. From posters, from pulpits, from records. But never from the hearts of those who once heard her. Kayla's grandmother was one of them. She often spoke of the girl who made preachers tremble. She kept a scratched vinyl tucked in a drawer. Sometimes she'd play it while sewing. Young Kayla danced to that voice and never knowing the name, just feeling its truth. Now, standing beside Lorraine, everything aligned. The tone, the eyes, the peace. She gently touched her shoulder. "You're the one who recorded Magdalene's." "Him, right?" Lorraine smiled softly. "With tears, child." "Yes." Inside, Clarice remained on her knees, quiet, but torn. She faintly remembered visiting Lorraine's old church with her mother as a child. The voice, the wooden benches, an old woman offering her water, calling her daughter. That woman was Eunice, and the quiet girl in the corner, Lorraine. Clarice wasn't sure, but something deep stirred. It felt like the past had returned not just for apology, but for redemption. Kayla sat beside Lorraine again. "Did you ever think of coming back?" she asked gently. Lorraine sighed. "Sometimes. But I had a better audience, my mother. And God, that was enough. Kayla nodded. But today, your voice came home. Lorraine looked at the church. No, it never left. They were just too deaf to hear it. They both laughed. Not in sarcasm and relief, in reconnection. Down the church hallway, a photo wall showed past celebrations. Perfect, polished. But outside that frame sat the woman who taught this city to sing. No makeup, no spotlight, just faith and scars. Lorraine stood. Her knees ached, but her heart beat strong. The past wasn't here for glory. It was here to remind them the forgotten is also sacred. Cliffhanger. Clarice finally stood. Her eyes met Lorraine's, and in the Reverend's gaze, for the first time, there was respect. She breathed deep and took the first step toward the door, toward what pride had once silenced. Clarice walked slowly, feeling each step from altar to door like an inward journey. The white and gold robe brushed the floor, but in that moment, no garment held authority, only vulnerability. The congregation watched in reverent silence. No one dared interrupt. Lorraine remained seated, her gaze now locked with Clarice's, and in that look was something sermons couldn't reach: acknowledgement. The Reverend stopped just a few steps from the entrance, swallowed hard, and breathed deeply, as if shedding her own image. Kayla stepped aside. Clarice looked at Lorraine like one looks at a living memory. "Forgive me," she said, voice low but steady. Lorraine simply nodded, unrushed. "I forgot where we came from, the old wooden pews, voices without microphones, hands praying silently before preaching." Lorraine smiled, eyes glassy. "You didn't forget alone, child. The world forgot too." It wasn't a victory speech. It was healing, a kind of truth that doesn't fit on pulpits, but rebuilds churches. Clarice knelt before Lorraine. The congregation gasped. In decades of ministry, no one had seen her kneel before anyone. But in this act, there was no shame, only reverence. "You brought something back that we didn't even know we were missing." Lorraine gently touched the Reverend's head. "I didn't come to sing, Pastor. I just wanted to sit on the bench, where my mother prayed." The words, simple, pierced institutional pride. The structure of faith trembled, and breathed again. A woman in the third row wept. A man stood and knelt in the aisle alone. The shift was invisible to hurried eyes, but God was sowing something in the unseen. Lorraine, in a soft voice, said, "God never left the church, daughter, but sometimes he sits outside to remind us what matters." Clarice, still on her knees, closed her eyes and let the tears fall. The congregation began to move, not in panic, in return. The church doors opened wide. Outside, air filled the space. Wind, too. People stepped out to see Lorraine face to face. A young woman reached out. An old man removed his hat. Lorraine didn't rise, didn't make a speech. She remained, like a living altar, a reminder of all that is simple and eternal. A little girl in a white dress knelt beside her and softly sang the hymn. Lorraine smiled. That was church. Kayla returned with a water bottle and a cushioned chair. But Lorraine declined with a gentle gesture. "My place is still wood, still marked by my mother's hands." Kayla fought back tears. She understood. This was legacy, groundedness, roots. Clarice stood slowly, steadying herself on the doorframe. Her eyes had changed, less polished, more human. She looked at the congregation and said, "Today's sermon was sung by a woman who wasn't invited, but she was sent." The audience rose. Many applauded. Others just cried. Lorraine bowed her head. She didn't want applause. She wanted silence, and they gave it. Cliffhanger. Clarice extended her hand, tearful. If you'll allow it. You can enter now, not as a visitor, as part of what's ours. Lorraine looked toward the sanctuary and hesitated. Lorraine stood still for a long moment, gazing into the church like someone staring at an old wound. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. She knew crossing that doorway wouldn't just be a walk. It would be stitching back years of silence and forgetting. Clarice still held out her hand, and behind her the congregation waited, now with softened eyes. Lorraine rose slowly. Her body trembled slightly, but her steps were steady. Before stepping forward, she reached into her purse and pulled out her most precious possession, a black leather Bible frayed at the edges, worn from decades of prayer. Every page held silent testimony. In the margins, her mother's neat, tiny handwriting, verses underlined with pencil, dates beside promises, folded psalms like folded prayers. Lorraine held that book like a living inheritance. She walked with it toward the door. As she passed Clarice, she said nothing, just extended the Bible. The Reverend, surprised, received it with both hands, as if holding a truth she'd long forgotten to carry. Clarice looked at the worn cover, then at Lorraine. "It was your mother's?" she asked quietly. Lorraine nodded. She used to pray here, every week, always in the last pew. Said the best seat in the church was the one nobody wanted. Clarice gave a broken smile. My mother said that too. The Bible slipped open in Clarice's hands, and there, like a secret the years had kept, was an old bookmark. On it, handwritten, Clarice. Lorraine looked down, eyes glistening. She prayed for you too. The church fell into silence. Not the silence of absence, but of presence. Clarice stood frozen, holding the bookmark. She remembered. As a little girl, an old woman once handed her a piece of bread and said, "One day you'll speak to many, but never forget to listen to the invisible." That woman was Eunice, and the quiet girl beside her was Lorraine. The world had spun too fast, and now, all these years later, the echo had finally found ears ready to hear. Kayla approached, touching Clarice's shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Clarice nodded, wiping her tears. "Yes, now I am." Then she turned to Lorraine, speaking with a new voice. "You may choose any seat you want." Lorraine smiled. "The same as always. The last pew. In the back, where my mother used to sit and watch the heavens." And with slow, steady steps, she walked down the aisle. There was no red carpet, but there was holy ground, and those who watched understood. The gospel had returned. As she walked, some stood in respect. Others bowed their heads in prayer. Lorraine's presence wasn't a display. It was reconciliation. She sat in the last pew. The wood creaked as if remembering. Sunlight passed through stained glass, lighting the Bible in her lap. Lorraine closed her eyes. She didn't need to speak. The church was finally listening. Clarice returned to the pulpit, still holding the Bible. She looked out over the crowd and said, "There will be no sermon today. Heaven already spoke." The congregation rose, not out of habit, out of reverence. The Reverend then held the bookmark and read aloud. "Clarice, Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." And in that moment, she wept. Cliffhanger. Kayla watches Lorraine in the back pew and realizes that, among the many, this woman had become the heart of the church. She walks toward her, sensing that more is still to come. The pulpit stood quiet, but the sanctuary breathed. Clarice still held the Bible to her chest as if it could keep her heart from breaking open. Her eyes scanned the church, but her focus remained in the back, where Lorraine sat, hands resting on the old book bathed in sunlight. The Reverend stepped down from the altar without a word. She walked the aisle slowly, the sound of her steps echoing with the weight of her own history. Every pew held a forgotten chapter, every tearful face, a mirror. When she reached the back, Clarice stopped in front of the wooden bench. Lorraine looked up, calm, as if she'd known all along this moment had already been written. "I knew your mother," the Reverend said, voice tight. "She gave me water when I was a child, told me I'd be a pastor someday." Lorraine nodded gently. "She prayed for you, every week, said God had a call on your life, and you just needed to remember who listened before anyone cared." The words entered Clarice like seed into soft soil. Clarice sat beside Lorraine and removed her shoes. "I forgot. Everything. The dust. The smell of soap the sisters used to scrub the altar. The simplicity of services without sound systems, but full of presence." Lorraine took her hand. "You only drifted, but God never left. He waited, here, on this bench." The Reverend wept, the kind of cry that empties a cup long overflowing. It was the cry of someone who realized that glory without roots doesn't hold. Kayla came and sat on the other side. She looked at them both and whispered, "We sing, rehearse, organize, but if we don't hear the voices from the ground, our music will never touch heaven." Lorraine smiled, touching her face. "You have your grandma's courage." Kayla choked up. "She taught me to listen with my heart, and you taught me to sing with my soul." For a moment, the wooden pew became an altar. That forgotten corner became the center. God was there, and everyone knew it. Clarice pulled the bookmark from her pocket. She ran her fingers over Lorraine's mother's handwriting. "I was a forgotten sheep, thought I was leading, but I got lost." Lorraine responded softly, "And you were found, right where you were first called." The Reverend nodded. "I want to change things for real, not just today. We need to open our doors, hear the silenced, wash the feet of the forgotten." Lorraine looked around. "Then start here, with this pew, and never let the church forget it again." Kayla made a suggestion. "We could mark it, a name, a reminder, so no one forgets who worshipped before microphones." Clarice agreed. "Not as a tribute, as a correction." Lorraine closed the Bible. "Call it the Promise Bench, and leave it empty, because someone out there is always trying to come home." The congregation began to understand. People stood to touch the bench. Some left prayer requests, a handkerchief, a note. No one asked them to. It was spirit-led, organic, real. Lorraine remained quiet, but inside a prayer formed, that this reunion would ripple outward, that other forgotten sheep would find their way back. No need to shout, no need for silk, just faith and memory. Cliffhanger. Clarice held Lorraine's hand tightly and said, "You're not a guest, you're a foundation." She then turned to the altar, faced the church, and invited Lorraine to come stand beside her. But the old singer's answer caught everyone off guard. Lorraine stood when Clarice reached out and invited her to the altar, but instead of walking forward, she gently held the Reverend's hand and didn't move. Her eyes were steady, kind, and sure. "I don't need to be up there," she said, glancing back at the bench where her mother once prayed. Clarice almost insisted, but she understood. Not all greatness belongs on stages. Lorraine didn't want to be seen. She wanted what she carried to be seen, and that had already happened. The church stood in stillness, the air thick with reverence. Lorraine quietly returned to her bench, sat down slowly, closed her eyes, the Bible resting in her lap, her hands over its promises. No one spoke, until a small voice from the back began to sing, "Nearer, my God, to thee." It was the little girl in the white dress who had sat beside Lorraine. Then Kayla joined in. Then everyone. No arrangement, no polished harmony. Just faith. Clarice stood at the altar, not as a pastor, as a daughter, as someone who had found her way not through a sermon, but through presence. She turned to the bench and said, "Let that seat always remain open. Sometimes heaven sits there on just to remind earth where hope begins." The church responded with a whispered but powerful amen, because they knew what had just happened wasn't routine. It was resurrection of memory. Lorraine didn't sing anymore, but her voice lingered, not in ears, but in choices made afterward, in doors that would now open, in hands that would soon be washed. In every service where people remembered that before lights came knees, before rehearsals came tears, and before the title Reverend there was a little girl once fed by a woman nobody noticed. Clarice looked inward, not with shame, but with renewal. Her faith had also come home. At the end of the service, no one rushed to the parking lot. No selfies at the altar, just people, hugging, whispering prayers, touching the promise bench like they were touching a scar now turned into testimony. Lorraine stood slowly, adjusted her dress, picked up her crocheted purse and her mother's Bible, didn't say goodbye, just stepped through the door, the same way she came, simple, silent, sacred. Outside, the little boy from before waited. "Will you come back?" he asked, wide-eyed. Lorraine smiled. "Maybe, but what needed to stay already has." She touched his heart gently with her fingertips and walked away. Her steps faded into the trees, but her presence didn't. Inside, Clarice placed the Bible on the altar, asked that it never be removed. So everyone who steps here knows God's voice also speaks through silence. Kayla placed a white rose on the bench where Lorraine sat. The choir stayed silent. And in that silence, the truest service still lingered. Final line. Lorraine was never seen at another service. But every time that hymn is sung, it's as if she's there, not through her voice, but through what she left in the air. Because some presences don't need applause, just space. Not every revolution is loud. Some happen in silence, through slow steps, quiet gestures, and voices the world no longer expected to hear. Miss Lorraine didn't step on stage, didn't ask for a mic, and never tried to prove who she was. But her presence redrew the outline of faith for an entire church. What she brought back wasn't just a hymn, it was the spirit behind it. Faith without polish, worship without filters, and the reminder that the sacred might sit in the oldest pew. That church, once fueled by lights and structure, had to break to hear what had always held it together. The sound cut out. The spotlights lost meaning. And only then, the unseen began to shine. Lorraine wasn't looking for applause. She was looking for a place. The same seat where her mother once prayed. And when she sang, that space became more than a seat. It became living memory, because sometimes the sound must stop. For the right voice to be heard, there's no way to measure the impact of a presence like Lorraine's, but you can feel it. In how Kayla now listens to the choir, in the respectful hush that now fills the sanctuary, in the Bible left on the altar, and in the promise bench, now empty, but never truly vacant. Every Sunday, it reminds them that church should never be a stage. It must be a shelter, and that the truest faith often never comes through the front door. Clarice changed too, not just as a pastor, but as a daughter of a faith she nearly lost. She rediscovered that leadership isn't about speaking louder, it's about hearing what no one else hears, that the highest pulpit may sit in the back of the church, and that God sometimes keeps a voice for the day when everything else fails. Lorraine left without a farewell, but she left a legacy, because some stories don't end they multiply in new voices. And now, maybe the question isn't who was Lorraine, but who are we leaving outside? How many voices go unheard because they don't look like we expected? Real faith doesn't wear a label. It grows roots. And those who have roots know exactly when to bloom. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes all someone needs is for the door to open.